Xenobiologist Ferik Dasa had built a respectable, if unremarkable, 40-year career at the Threshold Assembly's Institute for Comparative Behavioral Science by specializing in something most of his colleagues considered too straightforward to be worth serious academic attention: the study of predator domestication across the galaxy's cataloged pre-warp species. It was, by the standards of galactic xenobiology, a settled field. Every intelligent species the Assembly had ever encountered, across 11,000 years of first contact records, had followed the same broad evolutionary and cultural pattern when it came to dangerous animals. You domesticated herbivores for food, for labor, for companionship in the rare cases where a species valued companionship from another animal at all. You tamed, occasionally, animals bred over many careful generations to have their aggression selectively removed, a process that took centuries and produced creatures barely recognizable as descendants of anything dangerous at all. And you never, under any circumstances that Ferik's Institute had ever documented, willingly shared your home, your bed, your children's nursery, with an animal still fully capable, at every stage of its life, of killing you. This was not squeamishness. It was simply good sense, the kind of species-wide caution that had allowed civilization after civilization to survive long enough to reach the stars in the first place. A species that invited apex predators into its dwellings did not, by any model Ferik's Institute had ever built, tend to survive long enough to build dwellings worth protecting. Humanity broke the pattern so completely, and so casually, that it took the Assembly's scientific establishment nearly 2 full years after first contact to notice the anomaly had ever existed at all, buried as it was beneath the far more dramatic and immediately alarming discovery that humans could not be conquered militarily, and the considerably stranger discovery, some months later, that humans might not even be biologically capable of dying of old age under the right conditions. It was Ferik's own junior research assistant, a young Nomarai analyst named Vess Thorn, who first flagged the pattern buried in humanity's freely shared cultural and demographic data in a report that Ferik nearly dismissed on first reading as an obvious data entry error. "Commander," Vess said, using the informal title junior researchers at the Institute traditionally used for senior staff regardless of actual military rank, "I need you to look at this domestic animal registry before I finish compiling the rest of the household demographics report, because either humanity's data reporting systems are catastrophically broken, or something is happening on that planet that our entire field has never had to account for before." Ferik reviewed the figures twice before he understood what he was actually looking at. Across the planet Earth, in the most recent full year of data humanity had voluntarily submitted to the Assembly's Open Information Exchange, an estimated 471 million households maintained as permanent voluntary residents of their own homes, animals belonging to a genus humans called Canis, and a further 373 million households maintained animals belonging to a genus called Felis, both classifications, according to humanity's own submitted biological data, direct descendants of ancestral predator species fully capable in their wild form of killing an adult human being through claws, teeth, or, in certain documented large breed cases, sheer physical force alone. These were not, Ferik confirmed after considerable cross-referencing, selectively bred lineages with their aggression instincts systematically removed over careful centuries of controlled breeding, the way every other domesticating species in Assembly records had approached the problem of living alongside a dangerous animal. Many of the individual animals in humanity's own submitted veterinary records retained, virtually unaltered, the full physical capability for lethal violence their wild ancestors possessed: sharp retractable or semi-retractable claws, powerful crushing jaw structures in several breed categories, raw physical strength exceeding that of the humans, who kept them as household companions, and they slept, according to an enormous and, to Ferik's professional eye, deeply alarming volume of publicly available human photography and video content, in the same beds as human children. The Institute's formal research proposal, submitted to the Assembly's Ninth Council 11 weeks after Vess Thorn's initial discovery, requested funding and diplomatic clearance for what would become the largest cross-species behavioral study the Assembly's scientific establishment had ever conducted regarding a single planet's domestic practices, a study that would eventually involve field researchers from 6 different member species, extensive cooperation from human veterinary and zoological institutions, and, before it concluded, at least one incident that very nearly ended in a second interspecies diplomatic crisis inside of 3 years. I want to be clear about the scope of what we are proposing to study and why it matters, Farrick told the Council in his opening presentation, standing before a projection displaying, in stark comparative scale, an adult Canis lupus familiaris of a breed humans called a German Shepherd, beside an adult Ilkeresh child of comparable household presence. Every domesticating species this assembly has ever catalogued, ourselves included, made the same fundamental calculation, at some point in our early cultural development, regarding dangerous animals. We calculated the risk of proximity against the benefit of companionship, and in every single case except this one, the calculation came out the same way. Keep dangerous animals at a working distance. Breed the danger out, over generations, before permitting true intimacy. Never, under any circumstances, allow an animal retaining its full predatory capability into the most vulnerable spaces of your home. He advanced the projection to a second image, a home security recording, submitted voluntarily by a human family as part of an earlier, smaller preliminary study, showing a large adult dog of a breed known for both its size and its historical use in personal protection work, lying motionless and apparently entirely at ease across the legs of a sleeping human infant. Humanity did not make this calculation, Farrick said. Or if they did, they arrived at an answer none of us have ever arrived at ourselves, in 11,000 years of documented assembly civilization. I want to understand why, and I want this council to understand that the answer, whatever it turns out to be, is likely to tell us something significant, not just about this species' relationship with animals, but about this species itself. Councillor Itten, whose own species maintained no domestic animal companionship traditions whatsoever, having concluded many centuries earlier that the practice offered insufficient benefit relative to its inherent risks, studied the projected image for a long moment before responding. "You are proposing," Itten said, "that we spend considerable assembly resources studying why humans let large predatory animals sleep on top of their infant children." "I am proposing," Farrick said, "that this assembly has spent the last several years slowly, painfully discovering that nearly everything it assumed about this species turned out to be, in some important way, incomplete or simply wrong. I would like to understand this particular anomaly before it, too, turns out to matter a great deal more than any of us currently expect." The proposal passed, not unanimously, but by a comfortable enough margin that Farrick's team received both the funding and the diplomatic clearance necessary to begin field work on Earth within 4 months. Quick pause here before we get into the actual field research, because I want you to sit with that comparison image for a second, the same way the Council had to. A predator built to kill, lying across a sleeping human baby, completely at ease. If that doesn't already sound insane to you, you've probably just never had to explain it to someone who's never seen a dog before. Drop a comment telling me about the most dangerous-looking pet you've ever trusted completely, and hit subscribe if you want to see how deep this investigation actually goes, because it gets a lot stranger than belly rubs. Back to it. Farrick's field team arrived on Earth expecting, based on every prior model of predator domestication the Institute had ever built, to find evidence of an extremely long, extremely careful selective breeding process, one that had, over many thousands of generations, gradually and deliberately engineered the lethal instincts out of Earth's canine and feline companion species, leaving behind creatures that merely resembled their dangerous ancestors while having lost, functionally, the capacity for the violence those ancestors were once capable of. They found instead something considerably more unsettling, a discovery that took the team's senior geneticist, a meticulous Drosser researcher named Kessa Bren, nearly 6 months of painstaking comparative analysis to confirm beyond any reasonable scientific doubt. The lethal capability had never been removed at all. I have run this analysis 11 separate times, using 11 different genetic markers associated with predatory aggression across canine, feline, and, for comparative purposes, Several wild ancestral lineages still present on Earth today, Kessa told the assembled field team 6 months into the study, in a briefing that Ferrick would later describe in his own private notes as the moment the entire research project's original premise quietly collapsed. The domestic dog retains in full the genetic and neurological architecture necessary for a fully lethal predatory response. So does the domestic cat, to an even greater degree, given that feline domestication has occurred over a considerably shorter time frame and with far less deliberate human breeding intervention than canine domestication. These are not animals that have had their capacity for violence engineered away. These are animals that have retained the full capacity for violence and have simply, for reasons my discipline does not yet have a framework to explain, chosen, on some deep instinctual level, our current models cannot account for, not to use it against the specific humans they live alongside. Chosen, Counselor Itten repeated, when the finding reached the Ninth Council in a formal supplementary report 3 months later, his tone carrying the particular skepticism of someone being asked to accept a claim that violated everything his species' own scientific tradition understood about animal behavior. You are asking this council to accept that a predatory animal, retaining full and complete capacity for lethal violence, is making an ongoing, continuous choice not to exercise that capacity against a much weaker, much slower, entirely vulnerable species sharing its living space, and that this choice is somehow voluntary rather than the product of careful selective engineering. I am telling you what 6 months of rigorous genetic and behavioral analysis has shown us, Counselor, Kessa said. I understand how it sounds. I did not believe it myself until I had run the analysis for the 9th time, specifically trying to disprove it. The behavioral data, once the field team began compiling it in earnest, painted a picture that was, in its own way, even more disorienting than the genetic findings. Human injury statistics, painstakingly gathered from public health records across dozens of countries, confirmed that domestic dogs and cats did, in fact, injure millions of human beings every year, a figure assembly researchers initially seized upon as confirmation that the danger Ferrick's team had been studying was real and ongoing, rather than some kind of statistical illusion. Bites, scratches, occasional serious maulings, a small but consistent number of fatalities, disproportionately concentrated among the very young and the very old, exactly the populations, by every assembly behavioral model, that a rational predator-keeping species should have worked hardest to protect from exactly this kind of risk. And yet the same data, examined more closely, revealed something that undermined the simple predator danger framing almost as thoroughly as Kessa's genetic findings had. The overwhelming majority of injuries, across every dataset the team examined, occurred not from animals attacking without provocation, in the sudden, unpredictable manner assembly researchers had initially expected from a genuinely dangerous predator sharing close quarters with vulnerable prey, but from what human veterinary behaviorists, interviewed extensively by the field team, consistently described using a vocabulary the assembly's own researchers found strikingly, almost uncomfortably familiar from an entirely different area of their recent studies of humanity. Warning signs, escalation patterns, communication failures. These animals are not attacking humans the way a predator attacks prey. A human veterinary behaviorist named Dr. Priya Nandakumar, who had spent considerably more of her career than she ever expected explaining basic dog behavior to a delegation of increasingly baffled alien researchers, told Ferrick's team during an extended interview conducted at her clinic outside Chicago. In the overwhelming majority of documented bite incidents, the animal gave multiple, clearly recognizable warning signals beforehand: stiffened posture, low growling, showing teeth without biting, moving away from the source of stress, before ever escalating to actual physical harm. Most of the injuries you're finding in those statistics happened because a human, usually a child too young to understand or correctly read those signals, or occasionally an adult who simply wasn't paying close enough attention, missed every one of those warnings and kept pushing past a boundary the animal had already communicated, as clearly as it possibly could, that it needed respected. You are describing, Ferrick said slowly, working through the translation with unusual care, a communication system between two entirely different species, one lacking anything resembling human language. I'm describing exactly that, Dr. Nandakumar said. It took our own species thousands of years to fully understand it honestly, and most individual humans still misread it constantly, which is exactly why those injury statistics exist at all. But the dogs themselves have never stopped trying to communicate clearly. They've been doing it the entire time we've lived alongside them. We're just not always very good listeners, even after all this time. It was a single incident, 6 weeks into the field team's residential observation program, a program in which volunteer human families had agreed to allow continuous, unobtrusive monitoring of their household pets for research purposes, that finally gave Ferrick's team the piece of evidence that would eventually reshape the entire assembly's understanding of what they were actually looking at. The household belonged to a human family in rural Montana, a working ranch property maintained by a woman named Ellen Marsh and her 7-year-old daughter Callie, along with 2 dogs, a large mixed-breed animal named Bear, who had, according to the family's own account, been rescued as an adult from a difficult and poorly documented previous situation, and a smaller older dog named Pepper, who had lived with the family since Callie's infancy. The incident began, according to the monitoring team's recorded footage, with nothing more alarming than an ordinary afternoon, Callie playing alone in the yard while her mother worked inside the ranch house, both dogs present and apparently unremarkable, until a rattlesnake, common enough to the region that the family had installed specific fencing precisely to reduce this exact risk, found its way through a gap in that fencing and coiled, unnoticed by the child, in the grass directly in Callie's path. Bear, the larger of the 2 dogs, an animal whose genetic profile Kessa's earlier analysis had already confirmed, retained the full lethal capability of its mixed working breed ancestry, moved between the child and the snake in under 2 seconds, according to the footage's precise timestamp, placing his own body directly in the strike zone, and was bitten once, on the foreleg, absorbing an envenomation that would require immediate, aggressive veterinary intervention and nearly 3 weeks of recovery, before the animal himself made any sound at all loud enough to bring Ellen Marsh running from the house. Ferrick reviewed the footage 9 times before he brought it to the full Institute team for formal analysis, and he brought with it a question that would, in the months that followed, prove considerably harder for the Assembly's scientific establishment to answer than any purely genetic or statistical finding had been. Every predatory instinct model my discipline has ever built, Ferrick told his assembled team, predicts self-preservation as the dominant behavioral driver in any dangerous encounter, particularly for an animal with no direct genetic relationship to the human child it protected, no formal training that we are aware of specific to this scenario, and every physical capability necessary to simply retreat from danger rather than absorb it. I want someone on this team to explain to me, using any model our field currently possesses, why this did not happen. Why instead, this animal appears to have made a rapid, decisive choice to place itself between danger and a member of a different species entirely, at direct and predictable cost to its own safety. For reasons that have nothing whatsoever to do with any genetic self-interest, our current understanding of animal behavior can account for. No one on the team had an answer, not that day, and not for a considerable time afterward. All right. If that story about the dog and the rattlesnake didn't get you, I don't know what will, and I promise you the researchers felt exactly the same way watching that footage for the first time. This is where the investigation actually starts getting good, because the answer they eventually landed on wasn't just about dogs. Stick around, comment if you've got a story like this about your own pet. I read every single one of them, and make sure you're subscribed before the next part, because this is where it gets personal for the researchers themselves. Let's keep going. The breakthrough, when it finally arrived, did not come from genetics or behavioral statistics at all, but from an unexpected corner of the investigation that Ferrick's team had initially treated as a secondary, largely ceremonial component of the broader study. A detailed historical and archaeological review of humanity's earliest recorded relationships with wolves, the direct wild ancestor of every domestic dog on the planet, conducted in partnership with human archaeologists studying some of the oldest known evidence of human-canine cohabitation. The oldest confirmed evidence, a burial site in what humans called Germany, dated to roughly 14,000 years before humanity's own calendar reached its current era, showed a human being interred alongside 2 wolves, Animals genetically confirmed as not yet fully domesticated by modern standards, buried with evident care, in a manner archaeologists interpreted as deeply personal rather than merely practical or ceremonial. Every domestication narrative my discipline has previously constructed, Kessa Bren told the reconvened Institute panel, presenting the archaeological findings alongside her own genetic data 8 months into the study, assumed a slow, primarily utilitarian process. Early humans, we assumed, following the same pattern every other species in assembly records has followed, would have begun by keeping wolves at a working distance, valuing them initially for practical assistance with hunting or protection, and only gradually over many generations of careful selective breeding, permitting closer physical and emotional intimacy as the animal's dangerous instincts were incrementally bred away. She advanced to a new slide, an artist's careful, evidence-based reconstruction of the burial site itself. 2 wolf skeletons positioned close against a single human skeleton, apparently deliberately arranged rather than simply discarded together by circumstance. This evidence suggests something considerably stranger. This burial predates, by our best current estimate, any meaningful genetic evidence of selective breeding for reduced aggression at all. These wolves, genetically, would have been barely distinguishable from their fully wild counterparts, and yet here they are, buried with evident personal grief, in a manner our archaeological consultants describe as unmistakably intentional and unmistakably tender. I no longer believe humans domesticated wolves primarily through selective breeding, the way every other domesticating species in this assembly's records has approached dangerous animals. I believe something else happened first, something our current behavioral models do not have adequate language to describe, and that the selective breeding humanity undoubtedly did pursue in the many thousands of years that followed was less a cause of this relationship than a consequence of something that had already somehow begun. It was Ellen Marsh, the rancher whose dog Bear had absorbed a rattlesnake bite to protect her daughter, who eventually offered Ferrick's team the explanation that, however imprecise it initially sounded to ears trained in rigorous assembly xenobiology, would ultimately prove closer to the truth than any formal academic hypothesis the Institute's own researchers had managed to construct. "You keep asking me why he did it," Ellen told Ferrick during a follow-up interview conducted several weeks after Bear's recovery, the large dog himself lying calmly at her feet throughout the entire conversation, apparently entirely unbothered by the presence of an alien research team in his own living room. Like there has to be some complicated reason buried in his genes somewhere. I don't think there is. I think he did it because he loves her. I think that's really it. I think that's the whole answer, and I understand that probably sounds too simple for whatever kind of report you're trying to write. But I've had that dog for 6 years, and I've watched him learn, slowly, the same way any of us learn anything, exactly what she needs and exactly how to give it to her. And somewhere along the way, whatever instinct he was born with about protecting himself, first just stopped being the strongest thing in him. She became the strongest thing in him instead. "You are describing," Ferrick said carefully, "an emotional bond overriding a fundamental biological survival instinct." "I'm describing love," Ellen said, with the particular patience of someone who had, over several months of increasingly elaborate scientific questioning, come to understand that her alien guests genuinely did not have a simpler word available to them for what she meant. "I don't know why that's supposed to be complicated. We've been doing this with animals for about as long as we've been humans at all, best I understand it. Somewhere back at the very beginning, some person and some wolf figured out how to trust each other enough to let their guard down. And once that happened, the whole rest of it followed pretty naturally after." Ferrick would later admit in a private note appended to his own field journal, rather than to any formal institute document, that this particular conversation with Ellen Marsh had unsettled him more than any of the study's harder scientific findings, precisely because it offered no mechanism at all, no genetic marker, no evolutionary pressure, no careful chain of cause and effect his discipline could trace and verify. It simply offered an answer, stated plainly, by someone who had never once needed the Institute's 14 months of research to already know it was true. The Bear incident, while dramatic enough to reshape the direction of the study almost overnight, was not, Ferrick's team quickly discovered, an isolated case. Once the Institute began actively soliciting similar accounts from human households already participating in the study, a flood of comparable stories arrived within weeks, far more than the team had bandwidth to formally investigate. Though Kessa Bren insisted on personally reviewing as many as the timeline allowed, on the theory that a single dramatic incident, however well documented, could still be dismissed by a skeptical council as an outlier rather than a pattern. It was, somewhat to the team's surprise, the study's feline case files that ultimately proved the most difficult for the Institute's behavioral scientists to reconcile with their existing models. Precisely because domestic cats, unlike dogs, had undergone considerably less deliberate selective breeding over their shared history with humans, and retained, by Kessa's own genetic analysis, an even more complete and unaltered predatory instinct set than their canine counterparts. The case that eventually anchored the feline portion of the study's final report involved a household in coastal Oregon, a single mother named Dana Ruiz and her infant son, and a domestic cat named Toast, an animal the family had adopted, according to their intake interview, largely because the local shelter described him as unusually independent and, in the shelter's own words, not much of a lap cat. The incident itself, captured on a home monitoring camera the family had installed for entirely unrelated reasons, showed Toast, asleep on a windowsill in the nursery, waking abruptly in the middle of the night, some 20 minutes before either human occupant of the house stirred at all, and beginning an insistent escalating pattern of vocalization directed at the closed nursery door, behavior the family's own prior observation notes described as entirely uncharacteristic for an animal generally regarded even by his own owners as aloof and minimally communicative. Dana Ruiz woke to find her son running a dangerously high fever, the beginning of a bacterial infection that, according to the emergency physician who treated the child several hours later, had very likely been caught early enough, specifically because of how quickly Dana responded to the disturbance, to prevent a considerably more serious medical outcome. "He's never once done anything like that before, and he's never done it since," Dana told the field research team. Several weeks after the incident, Toast himself observing the entire interview from a shelf near the ceiling with the particular detached indifference Kessa's team had, by that point in the study, come to recognize as fairly typical feline behavior. "I used to joke that he tolerated us rather than loved us. I don't joke about that anymore." Kessa's subsequent analysis of the monitoring footage, cross-referenced against the animal's baseline vocalization patterns recorded over the preceding 4 months of the study, confirmed that Toast's alert behavior that night fell entirely outside his own established behavioral norms, a statistically significant deviation. The team's veterinary consultants attributed most plausibly to the animal detecting subtle changes in the infant's scent, temperature, or breathing pattern, well before any human occupant of the house would have been capable of noticing anything wrong at all. The Institute's veterinary consultants, reviewing the Ruiz household case alongside dozens of similar feline case files gathered in the months that followed, noted one additional detail that Kessa considered, in her own private assessment, among the most quietly telling findings of the entire study. In nearly every documented instance of a cat exhibiting this kind of unusual, self-initiated alarm behavior on behalf of a human household member, the animal's own baseline temperament, as independently assessed by shelters, veterinarians, or the families themselves prior to the incident, skewed noticeably toward the aloof or independent end of the species' typical behavioral range. Animals popularly regarded, even by the humans who loved them, as tolerating rather than needing their household's company. It was not apparently only the most visibly affectionate animals who proved capable of this kind of costly, self-sacrificing vigilance. It appeared to run considerably deeper than temperament alone, buried somewhere beneath whatever surface personality a given animal happened to present to the world on an ordinary afternoon. "What continues to strike me about these cases," Kessa told the assembled Institute panel, presenting the Ruiz household findings alongside a growing catalog of similar accounts gathered from participating families across a dozen countries, is not merely that these animals possess the sensory capability to detect danger before humans do, though that alone is scientifically interesting. It is that they consistently choose to act on that detection specifically on behalf of the humans in their household, at what is, in evolutionary terms, no benefit whatsoever to their own individual survival. A genuinely self-interested predator, sensing danger to another creature entirely, gains nothing from raising an alarm. It expends energy, draws potential attention to itself, and receives no measurable resource benefit in return. And yet, across every single one of the 411 household case files this study has now compiled, this exact pattern repeats with a consistency our field's existing behavioral models simply do not predict. The pattern held, the team found, even in cases considerably more mundane than life or death emergencies. And it was, perhaps counterintuitively, these smaller, quieter examples that Ferrick found himself returning to most often in his own private notes as the study progressed. A dog in Seville that refused, gently but immovably, to allow its elderly owner to attempt the stairs alone during a period of declining balance, positioning its own body against her legs at the exact moment she reached for the railing each time. A behavior the family insisted no one had ever formally trained. A cat in Osaka that had, according to 3 years of consistent household observation, never once scratched or bitten the family's youngest child despite the toddler's frequent, clumsy, entirely unsolicited handling. Tolerating treatment, the same animal would not accept from any adult in the household without a clear and immediate warning. A large, powerfully built guard breed dog in rural Alberta that had, according to veterinary records reviewed as part of the study, spent 11 consecutive nights lying pressed against the side of a dying family member's hospital bed at home, refusing food, refusing to be moved until the moment of death had passed, and the animal, according to the family's account, finally allowed itself to be led away to eat. None of this is unique to a handful of specially remarkable animals, Ferrick noted, in an internal institute memo circulated roughly a year into the study. This is not a story about a few extraordinary dogs or cats who happen to have unusually strong attachments to their owners. Every household in this study, without exception, reports some version of this same pattern, adjusted for the individual animal's temperament and the individual household circumstances. I am increasingly convinced that we are not documenting a rare or unusual phenomenon at all. We are documenting the ordinary, expected baseline of what happens when this particular species forms this particular kind of bond with an animal, a baseline so consistent across 411 independent households that I'm no longer comfortable describing it as an anomaly. I believe at this point we should simply describe it as how humans and their animals relate to one another, full stop, and treat every other domesticating species' far more cautious relationship with dangerous animals, our own included, as the actual outlier requiring explanation. Kessa Bren, reviewing that same memo before it circulated more broadly through the Institute, added a single handwritten annotation in the margin that Ferrick chose, deliberately, to leave attached when the document was later archived, alongside the study's other working materials. It read in its entirety, "I no longer think we were ever studying an anomaly in their behavior. I think we were studying a gap in ours." Ferrick's final report to the Ninth Council, submitted 14 months after the study's original approval, would eventually attempt to translate Ellen Marsh's simple, unhesitating explanation into the careful, evidence-supported academic language the Assembly's scientific establishment required, though he would later admit, in private correspondence with Kessa Bren, that he was not entirely certain the translation ever fully captured what the rancher had actually meant. Our research indicates, Ferrick told the council, standing once more before a projection, this time showing recovery footage of Bear, fully healed, resting his head in Callie Marsh's lap while she read aloud from a children's book, that human domestication of dangerous predatory species did not proceed through the selective breeding process every other domesticating civilization in this Assembly's records has employed. We believe, based on genetic, archaeological, and extensive behavioral evidence gathered over the course of this study, that humans achieved something considerably more unusual, a genuine reciprocal emotional bond, formed rapidly, sometimes within a single animal's own lifetime, rather than across careful generations of deliberate breeding, capable of overriding even a fully intact predatory instinct's fundamental drive toward self-preservation. "You're telling this council," Councillor Itten said, his tone carrying less skepticism now than it had 14 months earlier, that humans did not remove the danger from these animals at all. They simply gave the animals a reason not to use it. I am telling this council, Ferrick said, that I do not believe humanity ever set out to solve the problem of dangerous animals the way every other species in this assembly has approached it. I do not believe they ever saw it as a problem to be solved through careful, cautious engineering in the first place. I believe, based on everything my team has gathered over 14 months of study, that they simply extended the same particular quality that has apparently defined nearly everything else we have learned about this species since first contact: an unusually deep, unusually costly capacity for empathy, extended not only toward each other, but toward creatures with no genetic relationship to them at all, no shared language, and every physical capability necessary to kill them. And astonishingly, terrifyingly, it appears to have worked, not once, not in one isolated case, but across an entire species relationship with dangerous animals stretching back at least 14,000 years, repeated in nearly 500 million households on that planet today. A Varathi military observer present at the council session, invited in a purely advisory capacity, given his species' well-documented interest in anything relating to controlled aggression and instinct discipline, requested and was granted permission to address the findings directly. And the question he raised was one Ferrick's team had, in fact, quietly debated among themselves for much of the study's final months, without ever reaching a fully satisfying answer. You have described a bond capable of overriding a predator's fundamental survival instinct, the Varathi observer said. My own species spends generations training warriors to override our own instinct toward self-preservation in service of a cause greater than the individual, and we consider this among the highest achievements our culture is capable of producing, requiring rigorous discipline, careful selection, and years of dedicated training even to approach reliably. You are telling this council that an untrained animal, sharing no language and no cultural tradition with the humans in its household, achieves something functionally comparable within the span of a single ordinary domestic relationship, sometimes by your own team's data within a matter of months. I confess I find this considerably more difficult to accept than any of your genetic or archaeological evidence alone. I understand the skepticism, and I do not think it is unreasonable, Ferrick said. I would ask you to consider, however, that your own species achieves its discipline through structure, hierarchy, and deliberate training specifically because the instinct you are overriding has no natural incentive to be overridden at all. What our study appears to show is something different in kind, not a discipline imposed from outside the animal, but an incentive that emerges from within the relationship itself. These animals are not being trained to suppress their instincts through willpower the way your warriors are. They appear, instead, to be developing a new and equally powerful instinct entirely, one aimed specifically at the well-being of a particular human or group of humans, that simply becomes, in the moment it matters most, stronger than the older instinct it appears to override. I do not believe this makes the phenomenon less remarkable than what your own culture achieves through discipline. I believe it may make it considerably more remarkable, precisely because no one had to teach it deliberately at all. The Varathi observer did not respond immediately, and when he did, it was not with further challenge but with a question Ferrick had not expected from a representative of a species not typically associated with sentiment. Do you believe, the observer asked, that this capacity could be cultivated deliberately in a species that does not currently possess it? Or is it, as you say, simply and uniquely human? I do not know, Ferrick admitted. I would like very much to find out. The observer's question stayed with Ferrick longer than almost any other exchange from the entire 14-month study, in part because it was the first time in his career that a member of a species built almost entirely around discipline and controlled aggression had asked him, without irony, whether that same discipline might someday be redirected toward something as ordinary and as apparently difficult to engineer as simply choosing to love something enough to protect it without being told to. The finding, once it reached wider assembly public discourse, produced a reaction Ferrick had genuinely not anticipated when his study first began, a reaction that shifted, gradually but unmistakably, from the fear his institute's earliest, more cautious reports had assumed such a finding would generate, toward something closer to fascination, and in more than a few individual cases across several assembly member species, something that looked remarkably like envy. Vess Thorne, the young Namarai researcher whose initial data anomaly had started the entire investigation, requested, near the conclusion of the study, formal permission to relocate the Institute's remaining fieldwork to her own personal residence for several months, a request that raised eyebrows among the Institute's senior staff until she explained her reasoning. I have spent 14 months documenting a species that appears to have discovered something our own culture never thought to look for, Vess told Ferrick, in a private conversation he would later include, with her permission, in the study's concluding remarks. We have spent centuries perfecting the controlled breeding of docile companion organisms, animals engineered, generation after careful generation, to pose no risk to us at all. I do not think we ever once considered that the risk itself might be part of what makes the bond humans have with these animals so evidently, so measurably meaningful to them. I would like to understand, before this study concludes, whether that capacity, whatever it actually is, exists in any form within my own species, or whether it is something genuinely, uniquely human. Vess Thorne's own experiment, conducted informally and without any official institute sanction over the study's final 4 months, involved fostering an adult rescue dog, a mid-sized mixed-breed animal named Junie, who had, according to the shelter's own notes, been passed over for adoption 3 separate times owing to a documented history of anxious, occasionally defensive behavior around unfamiliar handlers. Vess kept detailed personal notes throughout the fostering period, notes she later shared with Ferrick only partly for the sake of scientific completeness. The early notes described caution on both sides, an animal that flinched at sudden movement and a researcher uncertain how to interpret behavior. Her own species' cultural frameworks had no ready category for it all. The later notes described something considerably different, an animal that had, by the end of the 4th month, taken to sleeping pressed against Vess's side each night, and a researcher who found herself, to her own visible surprise recorded in the notes themselves, speaking to the animal in a soft, unguarded register her institute colleagues had genuinely never heard her use with another Namarai, let alone with an animal from an entirely different planet. I do not know if what I have with Junie is the same thing Ellen Marsh has with Bear, Vess wrote, in the final entry of her personal log, an entry she gave Ferrick permission to quote in his own concluding remarks to the council. I do not think our 2 species process attachment identically, and I do not think I have 14,000 years of shared history with dogs the way humans do. But I believe, watching her choose, every single night, to place herself between me and the door of my own quarters before she will finally settle down to sleep, that whatever this is, it did not require me to be human to receive it. It only required me to be patient and to be honest with her, in whatever limited way our 2 species can manage to be honest with one another at all. Ferrick did not have an answer for her, not with any scientific confidence, though he would note in his own closing remarks to the 9th Council that Vess Thorne was not the only assembly researcher on the study who had, by its conclusion, quietly petitioned Earth's veterinary and rescue organizations about the possibility of adopting a dog of her own. The 9th Council's final acknowledgement of the study, delivered nearly 2 years after Vess Thorne's original data anomaly first crossed Ferrick Dass's desk, did not take the form of any formal decree or classification, the way so many of the Assembly's prior findings about humanity had. It arrived instead as a brief, almost understated addendum to the Assembly's ongoing cultural and behavioral record on the species, a single paragraph that Ferrick would keep, printed and framed, in his own office for the remainder of his career. Supplementary finding regarding human domestic companion practices. Extensive study confirms that the species-designated Homo sapiens maintains voluntary, close proximity relationships with animals retaining full predatory capability, a practice with no comparable precedent among any other catalogued assembly member or observer species. The mechanism enabling this relationship does not appear to be selective genetic engineering, as previously assumed, but rather a capacity for rapid reciprocal emotional attachment, sufficient to override fundamental instinctual behavior in the companion animal itself. This Assembly's scientific establishment recommends further study of this capacity, not as a matter of safety concern, but as a matter of genuine scientific interest, given the possibility that whatever quality enables this species to form such bonds with animals possessing no shared language, no shared biology, and every capability necessary to cause them harm, may prove relevant to a considerably broader understanding of why this species continues to behave, in ways both admirable and occasionally alarming, unlike any other civilization this assembly has ever encountered. Ferik Dasa, reading the final approved version of his own study's addendum for the first time, found himself thinking, not for the first time in the preceding 2 years, of Bear, lying calm and unhurried across Callie Marsh's small feet in that ranch house living room, an animal with every physical capability necessary to end the child's life in seconds, choosing instead, consistently, unremarkably, day after ordinary day, to be gentle. He thought too of Ellen Marsh's simple, unscientific explanation, the one his own final report had worked so carefully to translate into language his colleagues would accept, and found himself wondering whether the translation had ever really been necessary at all, or whether the truth had simply been sitting there plainly stated from the very first interview. I think he did it because he loves her. I think that's really it. In the years that followed the study's official conclusion, the Institute's findings quietly reshaped, in small but persistent ways, how several assembly member species approach their own relationships with animals back on their home worlds. The Nomari Cultural Ministry, in a decision Vess Thorne herself would later describe as directly influenced by her own experience fostering Junie, funded a modest pilot program exploring whether closer, less rigidly controlled relationships with the planet's own semi-domesticated fauna might produce comparable bonds, results that remained, by the time Ferik retired from the Institute some years later, promising but far from conclusive. The Drasa Combine, characteristically, produced an extensive market analysis on the commercial potential of human-style companion-animal relationships, a report Kesselbren found both faintly absurd and, in its own strange way, a kind of backhanded validation of everything the study had found. Ferik himself, in the informal, considerably less academic remarks he gave at his own retirement gathering, chose to close not with a summary of the study's genetic or behavioral findings, but with a story he had, by that point, told often enough that most of his junior colleagues could recite it alongside him. When I began this study, he told the assembled researchers, many of whom had joined the Institute long after the Earth fieldwork concluded, I expected to document a dangerous oversight, a species too reckless or too poorly informed to understand the risk it was inviting into its own homes. I expected, if I'm honest, to write a cautionary report, the kind of finding this assembly could point to as evidence that humanity's remarkable resilience in other areas did not necessarily extend to good sense in every domain of its behavior. I did not expect to spend 14 months slowly, reluctantly coming to admire the very recklessness I had originally set out to catalog as a flaw. I did not expect to end this study wondering whether it was in fact my own species, and perhaps every species in this assembly that has ever kept its distance from a dangerous thing rather than risk loving it, that had gotten something quietly, fundamentally wrong all along. He paused in the recorded version of the speech Kesselbren would later include as an appendix to the Institute's archived materials, and looked, for a long moment, at a small framed photograph he kept on his own desk, one his junior staff had noticed years earlier but rarely asked about, an image of a large, calm dog resting his head across the knees of a young human girl reading aloud from a book. I have never adopted an animal of my own, Ferik admitted. My own species does not have quite the tradition for it that humans do, and I am, by temperament, considerably more cautious than Vess Thorne ever was. But I think about Bear more often than I probably should for a researcher whose formal involvement with that particular dog concluded years ago. I think about an animal, fully capable of killing the child he loved, who decided, faster than thought, faster than any instinct model my discipline has ever built could explain, that her safety mattered more than his own. I do not know if my own species will ever manage to build something like that for ourselves. But I am glad, more than I expected to be when this study began, that I was given the chance to witness it even from the outside, even as a visitor from a species that still, on some level, cannot quite believe it happened at all. If this is the first time you've heard why an entire team of alien researchers spent 2 years trying to explain something a Montana rancher could have told them in one sentence on day one, you're definitely not alone. And honestly, neither were they by the time this study wrapped up. Thank you so much for sticking with this one all the way through. This is genuinely one of my favorite stories we've covered on this channel, because it's not really about aliens at all when you get down to it. It's about us. And about every dog and cat that's ever curled up next to someone they love instead of doing what their instincts probably told them to do instead. If this one made you want to go hug your own pet, let me know in the comments. I read every single one of them. If you're new here, welcome, and if you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss the next story. Until then, take care of each other, give your pets an extra treat tonight, and stay human.